Welcome to the Awakened Anesthetist podcast. I'm your host, Mary Roberts. I'm a certified anesthesiologist assistant living and working outside of Kansas City, Missouri. I created this podcast to give CAAs across the nation a place to come together and awaken to our profession's unique ability to create a life by design rather than default. That process can start by simply listening and engaging with this podcast. By doing so, you're already changing what's possible for CAAs, for you, for me, for all of us. I'm so thankful you're here. Let's jump into this episode and see what we can do together. Hello, welcome to part 2. And in this episode, I'm continuing the conversation of how and why and when I left my full-time job for a part-time job. The whole journey occurred over several years. And if you've not yet listened to part 1, please go back and listen to really understand the full arc of this journey. At the end of the part 1 episode, I shine a light on how this entire journey took time, and at many points along the journey, I thought it wasn't going to happen, and I was lost and confused, but something inside of me kept coming back to the idea that I'm allowed to want to give anesthesia and love it. And I'm also allowed to want to be home more and have a life outside of anesthesia. And for a long time, I based my self-worth on how much I worked and how much money I could make and what difficulty of cases I was asked to do or was able to complete. And while that all was deeply fulfilling and I think served a greater purpose in landing me where I am today, I do think that at some point I had to accept the idea that I was more than just an anesthesia provider and that was okay and that I could be both. And so this really 4-year-long journey from leaving my full-time job to part-time work is something that occurred slowly, and how now that I'm 2 years post quitting my job and still working part-time, it's easy for me to look back and say, oh, this thing led to the next thing to the next, and it all kind of makes sense. But when you're in it, it certainly doesn't feel like that. And you just have to trust that gut instinct that's saying, if you're not happy, if you want something different, that's okay. You're allowed to do that, and you just keep finding your way forward. So let's jump back in to the winter of 2018. I had just had my third child a few months prior. In February of 2018, I was returning to work off of a 12-week maternity leave, which I described in part 1. And the other piece of this puzzle that I haven't yet disclosed is that just as I was having my third child in November of 2017, I also submitted the final payment on my $160,000 of student loans. Just shy of 10 years post-graduation, I finally paid those suckers off and finished a long, long race to the finish line of paying off my student loans and being financially free from them. In many ways, I knew what life would be like once I paid it off in terms of finances, but I wasn't prepared to feel as free as I felt. I didn't realize that there was a part of me that didn't want to consider working part-time while I still had student loans. For some reason, I had thought, oh, I can't do that because I still owe for schooling. How can I not be working to my highest earning potential? And I just think I was a little bit confused over the reasons why I was working, and for some reason had really latched on, probably because it gave me a lot of purpose early on to work really hard and to be able to make a lot of money and pay off my student loans. That was such a priority for me. And so when I was free from the burden of student loans, I did feel a huge release, and I did feel like I had some more control and choice over my life that I want to say probably was there even before I paid off my student loans. But in my instance, it was the thing I needed to do first. And maybe by hearing me say this now, you might have some insight into how your student loan debt may be holding you back mentally. And certainly there's a financial burden with those student loans. But I wonder if we all reassessed the how and the why we're paying off our student loans and the speed and the rate and what standards we hold ourselves to, if there would be some movement there with us with designing our perfect life. So I digress a little bit, but we are now February of 2018. I've had my third child. I've paid off my student loans. And I knew that when I returned to work, I did not want to return in the same capacity that I had been working before, taking the calls. And I did describe giving away a lot of my calls in the year prior and sort of finding these connections with colleagues who wanted to work some extra shifts and I wanted to work fewer shifts. And I made some of those early connections that did allow me to work less. Well, I basically doubled down on those efforts in 2018 and I was able to trade, give away, barter, pay someone, give them cold hard cash to work my shifts. And I got myself down to working maybe about 35 hours a week. For the first probably 6 or 8 months of 2018, I was able to do that. It was not super easy to do in our existing structure. It was possible, which is how I was able to do it. But it was basically like running my own little locums agency where I was having people fill in for me and doing all sorts of wild switches. And you come in at 3 p.m. and I go somewhere at 4 p.m. And there was always this low level stress that either myself or the person I had asked to work my shift was going to forget what we had done and someone wouldn't show up. And in fact, that did happen a couple times and it was just embarrassing. And, whoever's fault it was just a byproduct of having to do all this fancy footwork around the constraints that my job had put on us. And unfortunately, because there was no flexibility in working a non-full-time shift there, this was really my only option. And at this point, maybe midway through 2018, I had started to look outside of my current place of employment just as see what's out there. I had started to talk to some of the closest to me CAAs, people that I consider mentors, and I was asking them what opportunities they might know about. I, just started to put all my feelers out there. I was kind of closely listening to any conversations of anyone who came through my workplace from a different institution and asking them all sorts of questions about what their work situation had been like and, just trying to glean all the little bits of knowledge that I could. I also remember dropping some hints, not super directly to my employer, that I was wanting less. I was willing to do really anything that would allow me to work less. I didn't so much care about the shift because I just thought it was going to be so wild if they let me do it that I was willing to work 3/12s or split a shift with someone or 4/10s or, really so many derivations of what full-time or part-time work can look like. I just wanted any sort of other option. And all of the side conversations and little hints here and there did amount to me creating a document and having a formal sit down with the anesthesiologist who had been fairly newly appointed to do all of the hiring and firing and manage the mid-levels, manage the CRNAs and CAAs working for the group. And I sat down and very explicitly spelled out what I was hoping to find with the group, that I wanted to stay, that I was hoping we could make something work. Here are all the many options that I was willing to work. And, I tried to be really professional. I had it all typed out. And I was not met with a lot of enthusiasm from my current employer. It just always seemed like I was trying to solve my own problem of I don't want to work full time anymore, by creating solutions for my employer that sounded really reasonable. And maybe a different employer would have jumped on them. But my particular employer didn't have the problem that I had. They didn't want me to go part-time. They wanted me to stay full-time. And so all of these solutions I was giving them and approaching them with just never caught on. They just never agreed to any of them. They never saw a value for me leaving my full-time position because most of the time we needed more staff, not less. And so they really didn't find it an answer for them to lose one of their most senior full-time people. And I only can suppose that's what their mindset was. Certainly that's how they acted towards me. I had thought that because I was senior and because I was a good worker and had always been productive and happy, that they would give me something that I want, even if it wasn't something that they really needed. And unfortunately, the summer of 2018 and then going into the fall of 2018, what ended up happening is that all of these conversations and these, sort of half-hearted negotiations, they ended up creating friction between myself and the current management, the current partners of the anesthesia group that I used to be employed by. And remember, this is a private anesthesia group, so there is no HR department. And so the things that I was asking for and wanting to do really had never been broached before. I was mostly the first person to want these different things. And so unfortunately, I believe they started to become sort of annoyed with my requests. Maybe annoyed's not the right word, but it just created friction. And basically the fall of 2018, I had many, many months under my belt of giving away all my calls and being able to manage financially about $50,000 to $60,000 less a year. So when I give away all my calls, that's about the income that I lost. And financially, that ended up being just fine for my family, my husband and I. We did a lot of work on our budget during this year. We did a lot of, I did a lot of personal development and self-awareness and tapping back into the person I was outside of anesthesia and all the many facets of myself that I wanted to heal or dive deeper in. And I started a bunch of creative projects in 2018, and I just inched closer and closer to this person who I knew I wanted, but was just allowing myself to say out loud, which was a person who equally loved anesthesia and wanted to do it, but wanted to do it just a couple of days a week. And then also wanted to be a mom and a wife and a sister and a daughter and just someone just to herself who had alone time and could, on the spur of a moment go for a walk or, had time alone at home. And it just became clearer and clearer to me that my full-time job was not supportive of that. And I do want to offer that this whole year, the year of 2018, when a lot of movement, now as I look back, did occur towards my being able to leave my full-time job. One of the biggest hurdles that I had to cross was giving up what felt like my earning potential. So as anesthesiologist assistant, you come out of school and are making so much money that it feels really expansive and it can feel joyful and it can feel like, oh, this is worth it. And I get to do this thing that I love. And I also, our culture is valuing me by giving me money, which, in our capitalistic society tells you that you are productive and worthwhile. That is the fact of our culture. And so it was very, very difficult for me to divorce my self-worth from the money that I made. And I had this little mantra that I would ask myself during this year when I was giving away yet another couple $1,000s of call pay. And I was thinking, well, maybe I will work that one. And, it's not usually that bad on a Wednesday night. And I do have the next day off. And, I was trying to justify that, like, man, it hurts to lose a couple $1,000s and, be faced with the opportunity of making it. And you could make it, maybe you don't have any cases on Wednesday night and you get lucky and, all the things that potentially you've also felt. But I would always ask myself, is working that call shift or is wanting the item that I want? Like, let's say I wanted, a massage that month or something. I would ask myself, is the massage worth an hour of work away from my family doing something else that I could be doing? Or is the call pay money worth the 12 hours away from my family? Like, how much do I value my time? And is any amount of money worth my time? And so I just held that close to my heart and my mind every time I felt that tug to kind of go back to valuing myself with how much money I made. I would just say, what is my time worth? And can I put a number on it? And even if that number is $120 an hour of overtime call pay, double bonus, is my time worth more than $120 an hour? And every time it was that my time is priceless. It's invaluable. cannot get time back. And that was the one thing that I wanted more of. And so even though it hurt, and it still hurts to even describe how much money I left on the table and continue to leave on the table, it has proven the best decision and the right decision over and over and over again. So let's move on from that idea. And I was taking you to the fall of 2018. One of my mentors here in Kansas City, who knew that I was considering and wanting part-time, I was telling a few people in my life. And as I was talking to the partners of my anesthesia group, it's a small group. People were finding out, people were kind of understanding that I wasn't happy. And I think also visibly, I wasn't as happy as I had previously been. One of my mentors here came to me and said that she had spoke with a local anesthesiologist who was a member of a competing anesthesia group at a competing hospital, maybe 20 minutes away from where I was currently living and working. And this anesthesiologist had said that they have a contract with a surgery center about an hour outside of Kansas City, and that the surgery center was staffed with all anesthesiologists. It was an all-doc practice, and they were looking at expanding and integrating the anesthesia care team model with, drumroll, CAAs. And she mentioned this because she knew that I was considering some other options. She didn't really know what they were looking for, and so she gave me his contact number, and I got my resume together and sent it to him and described what I was looking for. After a number of back and forths in the fall of 2018, he eventually said that the group was only looking for full-time help. And I had said very specifically that I wanted part-time work. And we kind of left it at that. Maybe there's just not an opportunity there. So I was pretty deflated. It felt like, here's my first real lead. Here's a new group. I could be the first CAA there. All of those things were very interesting and enticing to me. And yes, it was an hour drive from my house, but, maybe it's a new opportunity. It's something different. And I just thought maybe there was something there. And there wasn't. And so it was just kind of a bummer. And we were near the end of 2018, and I generally do a yearly review and kind of set out my goals for the new year. And so I was doing that on New Year's Eve of 2018. And I just sat down with myself and I was like, this has been really hard. I've wanted something different for, really 3 years. Probably had the first thought of it 3 years in 2015, and nothing seemed to happen. I could see that I was inching closer to this different sort of life in a lot of different ways, but yet this job that my entire world had been structured around, my entire family life had been structured around our call schedule, our entire family budget was structured around my contribution to the family budget. It all seemed like that was controlling me, the job was controlling me, and I didn't see a lot of opportunities to control the job. And so I was just dreaming and brainstorming, and I just wrote this letter to myself of what would my exact dream job be. And very simply, my dream part-time job was to work 2 days a week, to be able to pick which of those days I was working, so to pick my 2 days, and to get group insurance, which is very specific, but my husband is self-employed, and so group insurance was always something that tripped me up when I thought about working part-time. And one of the reasons why I never thought I could work part-time is because generally when you work part-time, the employer does not pay for your group insurance. It's not always true, but especially for anesthesia professionals, usually you don't get group insurance because in the situations where you maybe are able to work part-time, you have a spouse or partner who has insurance through their job, which was not my reality. And so 2 days a week with group insurance was my dream job. That was very simply what I wanted. And now I know that there is a huge power in stating exactly what you want to yourself. This moment on my couch, New Year's Eve of 2018, is a moment I keep going back to and thanking myself for laying out exactly what I want and committing to myself that I was not going to leave until I had exactly what I wanted. And so we roll into 2019. Really, it was more of the same. I continued a lot of personal development, a lot of self-exploration, honestly, a lot of therapy and healing some old wounds, moving forward with projects and creativity and aspects of my family life that I had been ignoring and tapping into what it would feel like if I was at home more, and just exploring all sorts of different facets of myself outside of anesthesia. And then in April of 2019, the same anesthesiologist who worked at that surgery center an hour outside of Kansas City emailed me basically out of the blue and said that they were having a difficulty finding someone to work full-time an hour kind of out in the country outside of Kansas City where this anesthesia group was located, and that would I reconsider if they were open to the idea of me working part-time. And of course, excitedly, I composed an email and basically stated yes. And because I had laid out exactly what I wanted, we were very quickly able to agree to the fact that my needs were to work 2 days a week with group insurance. So this anesthesiologist took that information back to the rest of his group, and they had a conversation amongst themselves. They ended up agreeing that they would be open to looking at someone part-time, and that, the group insurance wasn't a big deal. And to them, that was not a sticky point, but that they needed me 3 days a week and not 2. I received that message back and had to really do some soul searching and reconsidering of what that dream job might look like. And I felt like the opportunity to work part-time at 3 days a week with group insurance was a big enough opportunity that it was worth the risk of leaving my full-time, been there for 11 years, job for. Even though it wasn't exactly what I wanted, it was so close to what I wanted that I decided to take the risk and make the leap. And so in May of 2019, my new anesthesia group offered me a part-time position at 3 days a week with group insurance. I accepted, and I was so thrilled. I was so excited. I thought, how could I have got so lucky? I got so close to exactly what I wanted. Then the group informed me that because I was to be the first CAA at this surgery center, that they had to first get CAAs, like the verbiage of us on the bylaws, and the board of directors had to approve whether the anesthesia group could hire CAAs in the first place. And so I had this huge moment of high, and then another reality check that it's not so simple as someone wanting me. It is still a business, and being a CAA is still something new for many, many, many groups and in many states. And that part of the work that I had yet to do was to educate this new anesthesia group on CAAs, to help them create the bylaws that would govern what my duties were and how I was to function at the surgery center. And it wasn't as simple as being hired. So that process took almost a month. And during that time, the anesthesiologist who I had initially communicated with called me once and was like, I don't want you to tell your group, your full-time group, that you are quitting yet, because I'm not sure if this is all going to go through. And I remember telling him, I know I'm meant to do this. I know you're meant to hire me. It's going to go through. It's okay that it's taking some time. At that point, I had set the date that I was going to tell my anesthesia group that I was going to quit. And I said, I'm willing to wait a few more days before I say anything. Let me know when it changes. And the anesthesiologist called me back a few days later and was like, everything went through. We kind of had a little excitement over the phone. And the next day, June 25th, I put in my resignation to my full-time job of 11 years. I did it at night, about 9:30 at night, the day before work. I sent 3 partners of the group my resignation letter and asked to have a face-to-face meeting the next morning before work, which we did have. And I was able to tell most members of my group in person that I was quitting, and I was able to thank them. And while that sounds really nice and simple, it certainly was a bit rocky. I had a do not compete clause with that group. And at first they thought I was in violation of the do not compete clause. And so it wasn't so much a graceful exit as it was a reassurance that I was doing the right thing, that this group was not prepared to keep me. And in fact, leaving this group was what exactly I needed to do. And so my 90-day resignation clause began on June 25th, 2019, and my last day with my full-time job was August 25th of 2019. And that is the end of that part of the story. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my journey. I hope all the details I gave were useful and not just mindless chatter and banter. It was a long journey with many moving parts, and some of the threads through it, now looking back, seem more obvious than others. And I just wanted to point out 3 key factors that, after making this outline and recording this episode, really stood out to me as things that I had to have in place before I really was able to go part-time. The first of these key factors was paying off my student loans. Personally, paying off my student loans opened my eyes to other possibilities. It allowed me to accept the idea that I did not have to make my highest earned income every year to feel worthy, and it was just a piece of my personal puzzle. The second key factor in me being able to leave my full-time job was that I have and continue to maintain an emergency fund. I talk about it more in part 1 of this journey, but I have at any point since I started working had between $5,000 and maybe $50,000-ish saved. I do tap into my emergency fund for non-emergent things like for paying off our wedding and for doing some remodels on our home, but I am sure to at least have $5,000 at all times, and that just creates a sense of security. It allowed me to envision taking more risks, especially in 2018 when I described putting feelers out there and not coming up with anything. There was a point where I thought maybe I'm just going to have to work locums or PRN for a while and have to buy my insurance off of the marketplace and pay that big expense myself. My emergency fund was there to allow me to start exploring that option, and I think exploring the option opened my eyes to what is possible. It is possible for me to be a locums, even though I need to have the insurance for our family, and it wasn't an absolute no. And so without that emergency fund, I don't know that I would have been as willing to look at some of these more out-of-the-box options, not being employed by an actual group. And it just has always served me well as a safety net, which is, what it's called and what it's for, is an emergency fund. And the third and final key factor that allowed me to leave my full-time job was that I was very attuned to other people making shifts. I am, as I call, a curious question asker, and I love to hear other people's stories. I was constantly asking locums when they would come through our hospital what other places were like, and trying to gather as much information and intel from other people about other anesthesia groups and what it's like and what opportunities are out there. When we had new hiring cycles and new hires come in, of course, there was lots of conversation about what they had been offered at other places, and having that sense of community, even outside of the CAA community itself, like with other CRNAs or even with other anesthesiologists, opened my eyes to what's possible and the struggles that other people are also going through, trying to find work that fits their life and has meaning. It's not just CAAs who are struggling or can't seem to find the right fit. That's really a universal problem. And so it released some of the shame I think I did feel being a CAA and not having as many options I thought as others. And maybe I'm never going to find what's right because there's not as many job opportunities for us. It allowed me to switch the tune in my head to say, this is difficult for everyone. It's proving difficult for me, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible or that it can't happen. With those 3 takeaways, I am going to leave us there. I have since moved on from that 3-day-a-week part-time job, and I am in fact enjoying what I exactly set out New Year's Eve of 2018, working 2 days a week with insurance. And those stories are still to come. The transition from part-time at 3 days to part-time at 2 days has really only occurred in the past 6 months, and I'm recording this in December of 2021. And so I want to gather a little bit more history behind me and some more insights, and I will be recording those podcasts when I feel called to do so and share that movement with you, because I do think it is an extremely interesting story and second and third and fourth act to this whole journey that I'm on and currently remain on. So I can't wait to share that. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to this podcast by clicking the little arrow down in Apple if you're on the Apple podcast, and follow along on Spotify if that's where you're listening. You can also leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That's the #1 search engine where most people go to find their podcasts, and reviews help other listeners know what's good about this podcast, hopefully, and why they might like it. And specifically for other CAAs looking to create connection and meaning and find more purpose in what we're doing, and hopefully have more expansive conversations like these and open their eyes to what's possible for their own life by design. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you deserve to feel good behind the drape. Till next time.